Hey guys, it's Standing for Truth coming to you tonight. We are live. I've got a very special guest here. His channel is NephilimFree. I'm going to refer to him as Neph. He's very knowledgeable. I've seen him debate a lot of the same evolutionists and atheists that I've had discussions and debated with as well. So this should be good. I'll start it off with a couple announcements here. Um, Check in on December 5th on Modern Day Hysteria's channel. I'll be debating RJ Downard, should be fun. And also James from Modern Day Hysteria is trying to put together something on Saturday where both Neff here and I, we're going to participate in kind of like it's either going to be a 2-on-2 or 4-on-4 theist versus atheist discussion / debate. So that should be fun as well. And in January, they're working on Modern Day Hysteria's channel for round 3 with myself and Jackson Wheat. So that should be fun as well. But at the moment, I want to introduce Neff here, who can kind of just explain a little bit about himself, about his position, and about his channel. Go ahead there, Neff.
Well, appreciate you having me in your hangout. Um, I do Christian apologetics, have been doing it for about 11 years now. Um, I'm a young earth creationist. I became a young earth creationist because of the scientific evidence, not because of what scripture has to say. Although I believe fully that scripture is the highest authority and it is sufficient for someone to be a young earth creationist is by the statements of scripture. So I think that if someone reads the Bible and they find that young earth creationism is espoused there, and it is, that's sufficient for them to believe the earth is young and life was created specially by God, just as the scriptures do state. However, for me, it was a little different. I was a believer in Jesus Christ, but believed in evolution. I was indoctrinated like so many, like many Christians, in fact, believing that evolution was true, but Jesus Christ was still the truth. I didn't see the tremendous conundrum that created until I was exposed to arguments that it does create a conundrum, and then I began to study the scientific evidence for and against the evolution theory and the age of the Earth. And when I did, I decided, okay, this is a really, really, really important subject. I need to know the truth. And so I investigated the subject for about 5 months, very diligently. I stayed up till about 1:30, 2:30, 3 in the clock in the morning, almost every night for 5 months straight, going to work on half a night's sleep for almost 5 months, because I was absolutely determined to prove inconclusively to myself, one way or the other, that the uh, one of these two worldviews was correct. One of the things that drove me to be so determined to find out scientifically which is the truth was the fact that early in that discovery, I realized that it's unequivocally, unarguably true that the Bible espouses young earth creation. When I realized that, I found that there was a tremendous challenge laid to my faith. If science proved that the earth was of vast age or evolution was true, either one, then I felt, well, I have reason to believe whatever the Bible says is not worthy of being believed. And so I realized this is such an immensely important subject. I absolutely have to know the truth. And I decided to study the subject very intensively in a scientific way. And I did so for about 5 months. I was already convinced that creation and young earth creation were true long before 5 months was up. But being the stalwart that I am and determined to cover all bases and leave no stone unturned, I continued for about 5 months. At the end of about 5 months, I threw my hands up and said, what am I even fighting for already? It's conclusive. The scientific ideas of the atheists are implausible and proven impossible. and the Bible is absolutely correct according to science. That's how I became a young Earth creationist.
Well, that's a very very interesting story, especially because it's very much similar to mine. I started off as a theistic evolutionist, actually, and formerly Catholic, but after certainly a lot of diligent studying into the empirical evidence, and obviously, what I felt the Bible was clearly saying, versus a lot of what was being forced into the text by a lot of the teachers that I was listening to, at the time. For example, obviously theistic evolution is very much contradictory to, scripture, and obviously the nature of God combined with a local flood and a lot of these, what I would call, compromises. But when it comes to the empirical evidence as well, like a big thing that certainly made me, for sure anti, bacteriobiologist type evolution, and certainly a young Earth creation proponent would be that of genetic entropy, or obviously genetic degeneration, which I've certainly had in-depth conversations with a lot of atheists in regarding, and I've noticed that they've really got little to no answer for it. Because we know, and just to go into it a little bit, Neff, and maybe you can kind of give your feedback on it as well, and if you feel like it's as strong as I think. But obviously, essentially all mutations, obviously what they say is the driving force of this type of evolution, or damaging in some way, right? We know they cause aging, diseases, cancer. And as the audience is going to see, once we get into beneficial mutations, information adding mutations, they'd be hard pressed to find even one example. But what I find startling, Neff, is that most of these, say, 100 to 300 mutations per person per generation, which we know is fact, they're unselectable, which means they're unnoticeable, invisible, say, to natural selection. Much like, and I like comparing it to a single rust molecule, which would be invisible to a car inspector, right? So obviously we agree that natural selection is important, because it's going to remove animals, say, with damaging mutations, and obviously keep those with good mutations. It's kind of like a fine-tuning process, right? It's going to allow the species to be the best it can be. But with the unselectable mutations, Neff, natural selection, we know, can do nothing, right? So those unselectable mutations, to me, they're the Trojan horse of pond-scum-to-people evolution, right? They come in silently, they're invisible, they're unnoticeable, they're so small that they're going to infiltrate obviously us on a personal level and population level, because they're not going to be removed. They're going to build up, to a point that's fatal to organisms, and the population is going to become extinct. But what I find so amazing about that, Neff, is that it's so consistent with the biblical model, and obviously the fall that we read about in Genesis, right? This accumulation of mutations, decay, degeneration. How do you feel about that, Neff?
Well, I agree with everything you said. I think the most obvious contradiction to evolution in science is genetic mutation, but the most serious contradiction is the properties rather, of DNA. DNA is a four-dimensional package. The fourth dimension is time. A four-dimensional package of information organized by linguistically, which possesses algorithmic information processing. This proves unequivocally that life is a product of an intelligence. But the most obvious contradiction of the evolutionist claims to science. Now, hear how I worded that. The most obvious claim of evolutionists, how it contradicts science, real science,
Yeah, I agree.
is this false belief that genetic mutation is the base mechanism that designs all the structural designs of living creatures, that it formed the eyeball, the pancreas, the heart, the liver, the skin, everything about an organism, that accruing mutations build incrementally astonishingly complex and interdependent designs. in the body plans of living things is the most preposterous and scientifically disproved idea. Uh, Genetic mutation has been studied since the late 1920s, and one of the early forerunners of genetic study is a man named Haldane, and in 1930s, and he conducted a study of genetic mutations that he carried on for 40 years. And of course, thousands upon thousands of studies, many thousands. In fact, it's estimated possibly up to 1 million studies have now been conducted in genetic mutation. In fact, in most universities around the world, they'll be conducting genetic mutation experiments at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And they've been doing this for nearly a century. And the results are conclusive, consistent, and clear that genetic mutation doesn't design anything. What it does is it damages genetic information and moves an organism towards unfitness. That is absolutely the opposite of what evolution would require of mutation. Evolutionists talk all the time to the public that mutation is the mechanism for evolution. They'll say it on public broadcasting television. They say it in news write-ups in the news articles. They say it on science websites. Mutation, 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 mutation is the mechanism of evolution. The truth is, mutation is the destroyer of life. It's moving all living systems towards extinction. That's the very opposite of evolution. Evolutionists require, evolution theory would require a continuous input of new genetic information. But genetic mutation instead does the very opposite. It continuously damages existing genetic information. So this conundrum, the false mythological belief of evolutionists that genetic mutation is this grand designer, it's this mythical, magical designer of fantastical structural designs in the body plans of living things, is in fact exactly that, a scientific myth that's believed largely because people are naive and indoctrinated and uninformed. If somebody comes out from underneath this wool that's been pulled over their eyes and examines what the actual effects explained in the papers published in the science journals of what genetic mutations actually do to creatures, they will conclude the mutation is not a mechanism for the design of fantastical, complex, interdependent structures in the living things, but in fact a destructive event. And that's exactly what it is. So the whole evolution theory is predicated on this myth that genetic mutations build incrementally new structural designs. For example, the stinger in the tail of a scorpion. Now, at some point in the evolutionist idea, there was a creature that had a tail, but it didn't have a stinger. The stinger had to have evolved. Now, there are many structures involved in a stinger. There is the sac that holds the venom. There is the enzyme that is the venom itself. That had to be produced by evolution. Lots to be talked about that. There is the muscles that contract the sac to excrete it. There is the stinger that made of keratin which like a tube that injects the poison. Then there is the nerves connected to the brain of the organism that trigger the muscles that contract the sac to excrete it. All these structures had to have come into being when they did not exist before. Evolutionists have to claim that mutation designed incrementally, not all of a sudden. It can't have just popped into existence. That's special creation. It had to have incrementally designed each one of those features. Now, there's lots to be said about the implausibility of that scenario, of course, but this is what evolutionists are stuck with believing, that mutations actually incrementally design fantastically complex and interdependent features in living things that have functionality. That's actually the opposite of what science has demonstrated for so many years, decades upon decades. It's almost a century now from the science research of numerous scientists for almost a century that mutations don't do any such thing. They deform degrade, and cause death. That's what mutations actually do. And for that reason, I think by itself, there are other reasons, but for that reason alone, I think evolution theory is doomed. Scientifically, it cannot stand endlessly as an idea. Eventually, there has to come a time in the scientific community when evolutionists just throw their hands up and say, okay, I'm not going to teach this anymore. I can't believe this. This is implausible. I've studied 940 papers in the journals, and they all describe the destructive effects of mutation. Why in the world am I going to stand in front of 40 students and tell them mutations design fantastical things? It's just going to come to a point at some time, and this is only one of several mechanisms that's going to be the complete demise of evolution, that their scientific academics are just not going to be able, with a straight face anymore, to tell their students this is a mechanism for the design of fantastical things, when the papers constantly show the opposite of that is true. And for this reason alone, plus others, evolution theory is scientifically doomed. It cannot continue, and it will not last for another century.
And no, I couldn't agree more. I always say that, mutations are destruction, not construction. It's funny that they're obviously the only game in town for, the evolutionists. It's natural selection, which, is a fine tuning, well-designed process, and mutations, which are obviously deleterious. Even if it doesn't necessarily have, say, an effect on fitness in general. Any change, on a genomic level, it's going to be obviously deleterious. And I think, especially with the fact that, they can't provide us any type of observable and demonstrable mechanism that adds this new novel information to the genome, is very much telling. And that's a big reason why I got out of evolution and, being a theistic evolutionist and into obviously young earth creationism, because the examples that I seen provided, whether it was on, talkstupid.com or whatever it was, I mean, they were very much weak. A lot of them were, degraded changes. And obviously pond-scum-to-people evolution, it's going to have to explain, just like you said, in regards to, your explanation on DNA, it's going to have to explain how that four-dimensional genome with overlapping codes and chock full of information came about. And it doesn't have answers for that. And, some of the examples that I've seen, Neff, whether it's, aerobic citrate digestion by bacteria, nylon digestion, sickle cell anemia, melanoprotein, antibiotic resistance. I mean, these are all, whether it's loss of specificity, degraded changes, it's not going to take your fish to fisherman. And the fact that they believe that these examples are sufficient to explain, the novel and certainly meaningful information that's going to lead to these novel structures that you were talking about. I mean, it's flabbergasting to me. Have you ever seen even a slightly good example of a mutation that added even a little bit of novel information, Neff? Like, have you seen any presentations?
Nobody knows of any such thing. Georgia Perdome of Answers in Genesis is a PhD geneticist, and she says, I know of no such thing as a beneficial mutation. And now the reason she says that is because any mutation which seems to provide a benefit, like the one that the ones that the atheists love to throw up, that the mutation that makes someone immune to what is that disease? A virus, I can't remember, but anyway, it also causes red sickle cell anemia. So yeah. How are you getting a benefit if malaria? It prevents it creates immunity to malaria. But now, is there a benefit to that if it gives you a horrible disease that can lead to death? I mean, that's not beneficial. So, in fact, what a common misbelief about evolution held by evolutionists is that when bacteria are experimented upon with mutation in the laboratory setting, that they show that bacteria become immune to this or that, or an antibody or something, antibiotic, and they say, look, that's evolving. Well, there's two problems with that idea. Firstly, change does not equal evolution. I can
Yeah.
bash a car with a sledgehammer all I like to and change it, but I'm not evolving it into anything. Right.
Yeah. Amen.
So change does not equal evolution. Evolution requires specific type of change, and it requires changes to anatomy. If change to anatomy is not true, there is no evolution because you have no tree of life. Unless anatomy changes, there's no such thing as evolution. Variety doesn't constitute evolutionary change. But evolutionists put forth this false idea that any change constitutes evolution. But the problem with the bacteria is this: when researchers find that a mutation enables a bacteria to become immune to something, what the evolutionists don't tell you, those who know, the professional evolutionists don't tell you, and what the layperson evolutionists don't realize, because the professional ones don't tell you, and only the creationists do, is that the reason the organism became immune to something is because a gene that was useful and beneficial to the organism was damaged. And it's a damage event that causes the immunity. And when the bacteria, which have been mutated and now are immune to an antibiotic, are returned to their original environment, they die off and the unmutated ones survive. So what happened is the mutation made the organism less fit to survive. That's what it actually did. And they can't survive outside the petri dish. You see, put them back in their normal environment, they get exterminated by natural selection because they can't survive anymore. So this mutation that was supposedly beneficial and gave them an immunity to a man-made drug, by the way, something made with intelligent design, actually made them unfit to survive and is the opposite of evolution. But evolutionists put these kinds of arguments forth because this is all they have. They don't have any scientific evidence that mutations design structurally anything in the anatomy of living things and are capable of moving an organism toward becoming something other than what it is. A bacteria becoming something other than a bacteria, a lemur becoming something other than a lemur, a fish becoming an amphibian tetrapod, anything like this. They have zero evidence for that in the fossil record, in living things, or in biology. So they're stuck with putting forth these kinds of changes that don't constitute evolution, but unbeknownst to them, this is the irony of it. It's absolutely funny. It's actually the opposite of evolution because
the
it made
opposite.
the organism unfit to survive.
It's
Exactly.
devolution is what it is.
Yeah, and they don't even know it.
And they don't even see that these changes, because nobody disagrees with changes. And I always start off by saying, hey, what's your definition of biological evolution? And we agree that it's a change in allele frequency in populations over generations, but does that change have limits? And just like you said in the example you provided, they're degraded changes. And a big one I've noticed, Neff, is Lenski's experiment. And what's funny is Lenski's own data.
Yep.
And I know Richard Dawkins in his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, he goes in detail and he goes on a rant about how this is proof for macro and large scale evolution. But Lenski's own data, it revealed clear evidence of genetic degeneration. It was actually consistent with our model of, genetic entropy, degradation, obviously in the genome and in the universe. But what's funny is the evolving, and I use that, loosely, the strains that Lenski was looking at there, they're now degenerating to the point where they can only grow in a specific, extremely limited, and entirely artificial environment. So in reality, this big evidence for evolution, it's actually, a bunch of bacteria that are now increasingly disabled. And if you were to put those bacteria, say, in the real world, they're going to be extremely unfit to survive.
They die. That's it.
They die. And it's consistent with creation, our model. What would you say if they bring up gene duplication as a way to add novel information? What's your rebuttal to that, Neff?
It's not been observed that duplicating a gene can produce new information. What would have to happen is that subsequent mutations act upon the duplicated gene to transform it into new information. Duplicating an existing gene doesn't add new information. If you have a sentence in a book that says, and I started the car, and then the next sentence says, and I started the car, and I started the car, and I started the car, are you adding new information? No, you're not. You're just
Yeah.
duplicating existing information. So no new information is produced by the mechanism of replicating a gene, which can happen. So subsequent mutations would be required to transform that duplicated gene, that's what evolutionists believe happens, into new information that codes for something that's novel. But that's not observed. That's never been observed, ever. It's just a myth. It's a faith belief, but it's not scientifically verified. There's no known example of new information arising in the genome of any living thing. None.
Well, if you
And
think about it,
in
if you
fact,
think
it
about it,
can't happen, and I can provide an explanation as to why.
oh, exactly. And if you think about it, like let's say a given gene in a duplication, if it's been accumulating, say, deleterious mutations for a long time, now it's obvious that say that gene or group of genes, they're in a partially degenerated state. So say we duplicate that gene, the deleterious mutations are duplicated with it, and they're too ignorant to see that that's not going to, you know, attribute new novel information,
Right. That's
to
like
the
saying I
genome
can
because you
walk up a
duplicate.
mountain. I can take. I can walk up. I can get up to the top of a mountain by taking one step forward and 9 steps backward.
Yeah,
Ridiculous. Yeah.
it's ridiculous because I think it all comes down to, especially in everything we just been saying in genetic entropy and in mutation adding mutations. We know selection. No one's disagreeing with selection. It's going to remove, say the worst deleterious mutations, and it's going to amplify, the best beneficial mutations. But the point is, and what they don't understand, Neff, is that means that this accumulating damage, it's very much invisible, just like rust on a car,
That's
just like
correct.
one single spelling mistake in the encyclopedia may not affect the book or the encyclopedia overall, but over
Or
time,
your ability to read that word. You
it's
can
yeah.
understand the word just because there's a misspelling there. Everybody does that all the time. Oh, so he misspelled that word.
But over yeah,
Exactly. Yep. Good point.
it's the
Yep.
accumulating damage. So what's funny is even if these evolutionists presented us with 1,000 examples of, say, adaptation, whatever, via beneficial point mutation, gene duplication, they've still failed to address the key issue, which is net gain versus net loss. So it's funny that we'll argue all day about even one information adding mutation, but yet they're going to need 1,000, probably even more than that, to explain your fish to fisherman. And they don't see it. They don't see why it's impossible. And I liked how you brought up Haldane's dilemma, because that's another huge problem. How even if there was a beneficial mutation, it's got to get fixated in the population. Everyone else has to die off, or it's going to get diluted down. I mean, how does evolution stand a chance, Neff?
Right. Haldane's dilemma has not been solved. Evolutionists have published numerous papers saying they find it plausible that this could be a mechanism for solution to Haldane's dilemma, but none have ever said it's been solved. And they won't, because it can't be, because genetic mutation is destructive. Uh, Evolutionists, for those out there that don't really know much about this subject, let me share this with you. Um, in the day that Charles Darwin wrote his book, his infamous, I call it book, explaining that natural selection based on acting upon um, environmental induced changes to organisms' anatomy was the base mechanism of evolution, the DNA molecule was not even known. Charles Darwin didn't know DNA existed. Nobody did in his day. It was discovered in 1867 by accident by a German lab worker. He discovered chromatin because they had improved the quality of microscopes between the time that Charles Darwin wrote his book 10 years earlier and the time that the German worker discovered chromatin. The lens making technology had advanced in that 10 years time, and now researchers were able to see chromatin in the cells, and this German worker discovers this. Hey, he's poking around in the cell with a microscopic needle and says, what is this stuff? I don't, what is that? Over the next 25 to 35 years, it was discovered that DNA is something that if you mess with it, the organism comes out funky. Okay, really messed up or dead. Doesn't it, you poke around in the cell with it and with a microscopic needle, and you can in 1890 or 95 or 1910, this you're screwing up the organism. It doesn't develop right anymore, or it doesn't develop at all. So they started. This is critical to the organism. Whatever this stuff is critical. Between then and 1925 or 30, it was discovered that this seems to be a package of information that defines the organism. And that was elucidated by Haldane. And so um, this idea that organisms change in accordance with environmental pressures in ways that create new structural designs, new anatomical change, was a mythological idea put forth in the day of Darwin. It was not a scientific idea, it was a philosophical idea. And evolution is a philosophical idea to this day. Now let me share with you a couple of facts that disprove evolution unequivocally. Um, Evolution is disproved by the very existence of the DNA molecule. DNA is a four-dimensional package of information. First three dimensions are, of course, height, width, and length. It's a physical molecule. But the fourth dimension is time. It's now understood that genetic expression of specific genes takes place in an organism according with circadian clocks that operate while you're awake, while you're asleep, and certain genes are expressed more while you're during certain hours of the day than others. While you're asleep, certain genes are expressed more than others while you're awake. So there's time is a dimension that's added now to the DNA molecule. So DNA is a four-dimensional molecule of a package of information organized linguistically that possesses algorithmic input and output processing. Information, algorithms, and linguistics cannot be produced by material process. It cannot. It is impossible. These are non-physical fundamental entities. Information does not exist physically. It cannot be measured like mental properties. Cannot be measured. Material products can be measured. You can measure anything physical by length or height or width or mass, but you cannot measure a mental property, nor can you measure information. It makes no sense to say how much does that information weigh. That makes no sense. The Bible is a book of information, but if you said how much does the information in the Bible weigh, is a nonsensical statement question, because you can't weigh information. Information has no mass, it has no dimension. The same is true with linguistics, is a non-physical fundamental entity. It is the arrangement of information so that it makes sense by grammar, semantics, punctuation, syntax, etc. These are non-physical things. They are not a property of matter, nor are they comprised of matter. And algorithms are mental processes which require forward thinking and decision making, and they are also prominent and necessary in the genetic information. So these three, information, linguistics, and algorithms, empirically, that means observably, demonstrate that evolution is impossible, because the design, the structural features of all living things is defined by things which are products of intelligence and minds, not chemical processes. There is no potential in chemistry to produce information, linguistics, or algorithms. It's not possible. It's not that it's implausible. It's not possible. It's a category error. The DNA molecule is physical. Chemistry is physical. Information, linguistics, and algorithms are not. You cannot say there is, show me a mass of something and say there's information, linguistics, and algorithms there. And I'd say fine, but show me the physical way to measure that. It's not possible, because they're not physical. They're non-physical fundamental entities, not a property of, nor are they comprised of matter. So all living things are defined by information, linguistics, and algorithms, which are not products of matter, material interactions. Chemistry, in other words, cannot produce them. It is impossible. They are all traced, always, in every case, without exception, to an intelligence. Always. So, empirically, we know all living systems are designed by an intelligence because the genome of every living thing is dependent upon the fact that it is encoded information which is organized by linguistics and operates algorithmically. You cannot make those things from materialism. Atheism is a philosophical materialist ideology. It's a philosophy of materialism, and therefore evolutionism is false because evolution cannot, material processes, chemistry, cannot produce things that do not exist physically. Information, linguistics, algorithms do not exist physically. Now, some people will say, oh, that's just bull. Let me prove that to you really quick, and then I'll give you the mic. Here's a simple proof of that. Okay, the if I was to read for you the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I just shared with you the very first line in the book of Genesis from my King James Bible. But the problem is, when I shared it with you, not one, absolutely not one bit of matter from that book moved from that book to you. None of it. I shared you the information. You received it, and it's exactly the same. You got the information, but you didn't get one quark, one atom, one electron, or photon, neutron, or proton of matter from that book. So information is not bound to its medium. I could read the Bible to you. I can speak it to you over the telephone. I can type it up in an email. I can send it to you. I could write it in the sand on the beach with a stick. I can, in any medium, it's transferable to any medium, but it's not the medium upon which it's encoded. Because if a professor in a university wants to share information with his students, if information were a property of matter, then in order for the professor to share information with his students, he would have to literally transfer matter of his brain, where the information supposedly is, to all of the brains of every one of his students in his class as he speaks to them. If that were so, every university professor would become dumber and dumber and dumber with every word he says. That's a nonsensical idea. So because information is not bound to its medium, it's not, in other words, the medium is not the information, it's how it's arranged that gives us the inference of it, that tells us how to encode or decode it. Because information isn't bound to its medium, it's non-physical, information can't be produced by material process. And information is a non-physical fundamental entity. All living things are defined by information, which is not material. It's non-material. Absolutely contradicts the physical materialist philosophy of atheism and demonstrates theism. Now, here's why it demonstrates theism. Because human beings have a mind. We don't have just a brain. We have a mind. Minds produce non-physical things. Human beings speak constantly. When you speak, you use linguistics. You apply a meaning to a code, to something. You apply meanings to matter. It's nonsense to say that matter applies a meaning to something. That's nonsense. Chemistry doesn't have symbolism. When two atoms or molecules interact with each other, there's nothing symbolic happening. It's purely electromechanical. That's all there is to it. A molecule doesn't say, I think I'll represent something external to myself, something other than what I am. That's right. I'll be something else. Molecules don't pretend to do anything like this. See? So there's no potential for linguistics in chemistry. Linguistics cannot be produced by chemistry. Linguistics requires that a meaning or encodes to is applied to matter by an intelligence, and it's interpreted from a matter by an intelligence. So linguistics can't be produced by chemistry either. DNA is information organized linguistically. So information and linguistics have no basis in material cause. Now, what about algorithms? Algorithms are procedures, pre-described procedures That requires forward thinking in order to find a solution to a problem. The idea of solving a problem is a mental process. It's not a material one. Molecules don't bump into each other and say, "Hey, I bet if I bumped into those over there, I might could find a solution to." Molecules don't think; they just interact if they're able, right? So, it, it, this idea of algorithms arising by chemistry is irrational. It's not possible. An intelligence is required to create an algorithm. An algorithm is a set of procedures designed to produce an outcome based on a finite number of steps that it involves searching for information, comparing information, and making a choice about what information is correct or not, so you can decide what to do. That's a mental process, not a chemical one. So, information, linguistics, algorithms, empirical proof that life is designed, because none of them can be produced by material causes. Atheism and evolutionism are purely mechanical, electromechanical processes. According to evolutionists, evolution is purely chemical. If it were chemical, it can't explain information, linguistics, or algorithms. Therefore, because information, linguistics, and algorithms are non-physical fundamental entities, not a property of matter, and because information, linguistics, and algorithms are always, without exception, traced to an intelligence, we know for a fact all living systems are devised by an intelligence. They were prescribed by a mind. And that's the clincher that destroys evolution theory by itself. There is no argument ever been or ever could be levied against these facts. And that's just the way it is.
And you know what? And based on everything you just said, is exactly why I call what they have a science fiction based religion, because information to the depth that you just described it, and to the degree that you just described it in, it takes a mind. There's no other way to explain it. And I think that's why, based on everything you said there, and based on the complexity of obviously our genome and the information in our genome, we need to get past that naive and simplistic view of the genome, because now maybe you can elaborate on this too. We know that the sequence of our genome of DNA, it's in 4 dimensions, right? Like we can
Yes.
we can see the one dimensional, say, linear string of letters, the 2-dimensional interactions of, say, one part of the string with another, whether it's directly or through RNA and protein proxies, the 3-dimensional spatial structure of the DNA within the nucleus, and then the 4th dimensional changes to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd dimensions over time, right? So we also know that there's a tremendous amount of information packed into our genome that we have not figured out, right? Including multiple
Probably
simultaneously
never will.
overlapping codes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
probably
it's
never will. It's so complex. Probably never ever will. Yeah.
and really, if a 4-dimensional genome, as we're talking about here, Neff, is hard enough to grasp, like I just said, there's a huge amount of meta information in this genome. It's like information about the information. This is the information, that tells the cell how to maintain the information, how to fix it if it breaks, how to copy it, how to interpret what is there, how
DNA
to use it,
repair.
when to use it. It's amazing. Like there's no way to explain naturalistically the way evolutionists do this 4-dimensional genome chock full of information. I mean, it's just not possible. It's science fiction to say that it can arise on its own. Abiogenesis is impossible. It's all in the realm of science fiction. Like since we're talking about genomes, information here, information theory, I think junk DNA is quite important too. And it seems like a lot of the evolutionists that I've been talking to, Neff, they still hold to the idea of junk DNA, that our non-protein coding regions are
Right.
useless. And
Oh,
and
they love it. Yeah,
how do you feel?
they're still
How do you
holding to
feel
that.
about that?
Yeah, they're still holding to the junk DNA paradigm. They just can't let it go.
They
But
can't.
before I touch upon that, let me touch upon something else you said real quick. This idea that The paradigm is so entrenched that here's the crazy thing. When you explain the things that I just said, information linguistics and algorithms are the basis for the information of a genome that defines a living thing. When you explain that to somebody, even if you elucidate it very thoroughly, and I only touched upon it really, I could elucidate it much more thoroughly. Even if you elucidate it thoroughly to some people, and to a typical atheist, now, we would expect them to deny it right up front because you're challenging their worldview. You're telling them
Exactly.
everything they believe is false, and we expect them to say, no, that can't be true, but it can't be true because they don't want to say right publicly in front of you, oh, wow, oh, okay, so I'm not an atheist anymore. See, they won't do
They're
that, right?
resistant to the truth. Exactly right.
Right, but the problem, but that demonstrates that atheism specifically, and the way they hold to evolutionism is not based on science, although they claim science supports it when it comes to evolution, is the fact that you can elucidate it very thoroughly to someone who's an atheist, and what will happen is you'll talk to them again a week later or a month later or 6 months later, and they're still saying atheism and evolution is true, even though you've elucidated scientific facts that completely refute evolution theory. And they've studied it, they looked into it on their own, and they've come to that conclusion that they can't find a problem with what you said. They're back 6 months later, or a month later, or a week later, saying, no, evolution is true. Now, what's that tell you? That tells you that this person is married to a worldview, and it doesn't have a thing to do with science.
No,
But they're
it's
going
a
to.
worldview issue. You're exactly right.
That's exactly right. Yeah. That's exactly what it is. And now, when it comes to junk DNA, a number of professional scientists have said that junk DNA needs to be expunged from our lexicon because it's been discovered that the vast majority of the DNA is transcribed by polymerase in the cell. In other words, 80, the estimate that came out about 8 or 9 years ago was 87%. I think it's increased since then to 90% or more. That 80 something, I'm going to stick to the lowest number that I have for 87 or so or more percent of the DNA molecule is actually transcribed. Now, what that means to people who don't know what that means is there are molecular machines that attach to the DNA molecule, and they read off bits of data from it, and they spit them out as a separate molecule to be used for work in the cell. That's called an RNA molecule, ribonucleic acid. So, these machines, if they're transcribing the information, the implication is that it's usable, it's functional, it's important to the cell. If it were actually garble left over by evolution, then why didn't evolution stop all the machinery of the cell from reading it and making copies of it and sending it off into the cell? That's like adding garbage. The cell would be a garbage dump of useless RNAs. But we don't have any evidence in science that RNAs are useless. Whenever they study an RNA molecule, they find it's functional. It has some. Now, the problem is, because there's so much of these things in the cell, scientists have not found all the functions for all the RNAs that are in the cell, just like they haven't found all the function for all the genes that are in the cell or all the polymerase for anything else in the cell. We're still in our infancy when it comes to our understanding of genetics, despite the fact that we know so much already. So
we know so little of the DNA language. It would be premature for these evolutionists to say that, the majority of our DNA is evolutionary leftovers, is junk. It just makes no sense, especially given the trajectory that you're talking about of genome-wide function. Because if junk DNA is, say, non-coding DNA, but it's being transcribed into RNA, why is it going and using so much energy for something that is idle, for something that's not doing anything, right?
Exactly. That's a waste of the cell should have evolved in such a way that it stopped reading it. That's the point I was making. Exactly. And so that's a waste of energy. Why would the cell continue to do that? I
Yeah.
mean, if it created this much junk and it's not usable, why does the cell continue to use it?
Hmm.
That contradicts the theory. But uh, moreover, if it were junk, then it would seem that the DNA was simply eliminated. Why
Hmm.
wouldn't it actually stop hang? Why would it not continue to maintain it and not and hang on to it? That also requires energy. When the DNA is supercoiled into chromatin, you're packing a lot of stuff that's useless. It seems like if evolution were as smart as evolutionists claim, it would just simply stop hanging on to it. It would just negate the DNA that's junk and stop hanging on to it. But what's been discovered, here's the interesting thing, is that um, evolutionists made that claim largely because of junk DNA, because they were studying only the codes for proteins in the cell, which amount to about 1 to 2% of the whole DNA molecules, are codes that make proteins. Everything else is something else, and they thought all the rest of it was useless. It was garble. But what's been discovered, a marvelous revelation in genetics that's taken place since then, is this discovery that genes require information that tell them how and when to be made. Epigen, there are genes that code for information that regulate the expression of genes that make proteins. That's in the junk DNA. What was called junk DNA is now, some of it is known to be information that codes for telling the genome, the cell, when to transcribe a protein code, and how much of it to make. So it's not found in the protein code itself. It's written above it, on top of it. That's another subject. The overlapping and nested information, the compression of DNA. That's an amazing subject there. That would take a long time for us to elucidate. But so much of it, it appears that at least some portion of what this supposed junk DNA is actually information that tells the cell when to create proteins from the protein codes, and how much of it to make, and what time of day or night even. So that's the fourth dimension, time, of the genome. So it can't be junk if it's critically important to when and how much and what time to make the proteins from the codes over there. So that could not possibly be considered junk. That's critical. If you don't have the information that tells you when to manufacture the bicycle part, what point does it have? Does it make to have the information to make the bicycle part if you don't have the computer program that tells you when to assemble it, when to manufacture it? Right? It's the same thing with DNA. And now, one of the most remarkable errors of DNA, of genetics, of evolution thinking rather, is the existence of DNA repair mechanisms.
Hmm.
They used to call it DNA error correction. Did you know that? A lot of people, all the scientists used to call DNA the error correction. They used to call it DNA repair. They called it DNA error correction. But the problem was in the 1970s, when evolutionists realized that, oh no, error correction implies that the information was correct in the beginning. That implies design. We can't go there. So they renamed DNA error correction. They call it now DNA repair. Isn't that funny? Because of their paradigm. So
Hmm.
DNA repair mechanism. But why would that even exist if evolution were true? If random genetic mutations not only
Yeah,
built
good
the
point.
DNA, but also regulate it, why would there be a mechanism to maintain the integrity of the DNA against random change? If random change, that is, random mutation, was the mechanism that built it and supposedly makes it better, stronger, and more functional. It makes no sense. There should not be such a thing as a DNA repair mechanism
No, there
in a
shouldn't be.
cell if evolution were true. You see?
Well, I think especially everything you just said in regards to the function of our genome, junk DNA. Because I mean, at the end of the day, junk DNA really is decades ago, biology. But I think that kind of brings us to what they say, like especially R and Ron. We can elaborate on this. They'll say phylogenetic systematics is their best, demonstrable evidence. But what I find funny is that, evolution's so-called best evidence are mostly based on the concept of this outdated junk DNA, right? So since DNA functions are only beginning to be found, as you said, and we know so little about, the DNA language, probably less than 5%, but the trajectory strongly say that this vast majority of DNA will be functional, as obviously we're seeing here. This takes away their primary assumption of evolutionary phylogenetics, right? Because they are based on mutations for one and pseudogenes, right? Genetic markers. But if, as we're saying here, Neff, that the vast majority of DNA is functional, that means it becomes a common design argument, as we as creationists have always predicted. Because if the vast majority of DNA is functional, that serves as evidence for the biblical based model as compared to phylogenetics. Because if these are not evolutionary leftovers and the genetic markers that they're using are actually functional DNA differences, the whole phylogenetic systematics paradigm collapses. Would you agree
Yeah.
with that?
It does, and this is what evolutionists like R and Raw and others harp on so much today, is this idea of phylogenetics, because they think, well, the evolutionists have not accepted our ridiculous ideas that random mutations build incrementally structural designs that are functional in living things. They haven't accepted our ideas that uh, uh, junk DNA is actually true. They haven't accepted our ideas about this or that. So that immunities in bacteria are evidence of evolution, because change doesn't equal evolution. Evolutionary change would equal evolution. So now they're harping very heavily, and have been for quite a few years now, that uh, genetic similarities between different phylum, genus, and species of life is evidence that they have all common ancestry. But what they don't tell you is about the innumerable incongruencies with their supposed
Yeah.
phylogenetics, and lots to be said about that. I'm going to take about a 60-second break. You go and talk about what you want. I'll be back in less than 1 minute. Thanks. Hang on just a minute.
Yeah, not a problem. So to elaborate more on what he said here, a lot of these phylogenetic charts, they're based on these evolutionary leftovers. But obviously, as we were just talking about and proving that, the vast majority of our genome, the trajectory is, pointing us towards, genome-wide functionality. And I think it all comes back to the fact that obviously God created us with front-loaded DNA differences. So a lot of these DNA differences, this neutral variation, we can now look at it as functional variation. And it's funny, if you talk to these evolutionary scientists, I know Sam the scientist comes to mind when I had my discussion with him. They have such a weak rescue device in regards to, say, for example, ENCODE. They'll say that, ENCODE define their function as specific biochemical activity, which they'll say is too broad, which is really just an evolutionary rescue device. Because what they're saying is that, well, obviously, even they'll agree that ENCODE found that the majority of DNA is transcribed into RNA, which, as Neff said, transcription is really just the copying of DNA into another form called RNA. But in the past, this was thought to be exclusive to parts of the DNA that coded for proteins. Now, the RNA would be read in the cell and the protein assembled from these instructions. But since junk DNA is non-coding DNA, as Neff and I were talking about, why is it being transcribed into RNA? Now, what Sam the scientist and these evolutionary apologists will say is that this RNA is actually not doing anything, that there is activity, but it's not useful activity, as in, it's one of those evolutionary leftovers, quote unquote, that hasn't actually been eliminated from our genome yet. But it's really just a rescue device, because as Neff said, is why is our genome, why is the DNA, the cell, going through so much energy to transcribe this RNA if it's not actually doing anything? So they just don't like the evidence based on a worldview. And another thing is it hasn't actually been shown that RNA is non-functional. So at the end of the day, the evidence is on our side because we know based on this rescue device that the evolutionists, they're only saying this to accommodate the evidence within their evolutionary worldview. Just like Neff and I agreed, it's a battle of worldviews at this time. And from a biblical creationist worldview, I see your back, Neff. I'm just finishing up here. It would be inconsistent with obviously a logical, orderly designer God who we attribute to the God of the Bible to design organisms with a lot of non-functional DNA. So the fact that this junk DNA has activity and it's not idle, as we're seeing based on the preliminary evidence, may be functional is actually consistent with our worldview. And it's not consistent with their worldview, therefore they got to come up with their rescue devices. But in regards to the phylogenetic systematics that we were just talking about, Neff, and how there's these inconsistencies, are you talking about a lot of, their trees that don't exactly fit within, this neat and organized phylogenetic tree of life, such as, convergent evolution? The eye, I think they've said, has evolved how many different separate times? I mean, are these the rescue devices and inconsistencies you're referring to?
Convergent evolution, they call it. Wings did the same thing, apparently. Insects evolved the ability to fly. Birds did. Bats did. Dinosaurs did. I mean, come on. Evolution really, natural selection, is that genius? I mean, they apply God status to it. It's ridiculous. But yes, the incongruencies are tremendous. There are so many. Even evolutionist scientists themselves acknowledge it. For example, from a scientific paper titled "An Estimation of Eridicidae Phylogeny, a Combined Analysis Approach," published in PLOS.org, the scientists state, incongruencies across different data sheets is not a novel observation with mammalian phylogenetic analysis. Therefore, as a final test, we performed 3 combined analysis, genes plus morphology and genes, with the expectation that the morphological data would improve branch support for relationships discovered by genetic data. So they acknowledge the incongruencies across different data is widespread. This is just an admission. But there are so many. Let me give you some examples of actual phylogenetic discrepancies. An elephant shrew is closer genetically to an elephant than to shrews. Horse DNA is closer to bats than cows. A mouse DNA is more similar to that of this is roughly 80% similar to a human genome. Sponges share 70% of the human genes, including the nerves for muscles. Kangaroo DNA unexpectedly contains huge chunks of what we would call human genome. Neanderthal DNA is fully human. The chimpanzee Y chromosome is horrendously different from our Y chromosome. The roundworms have far more genes than Darwin could have ever expected, 19,000. Flatworms, snake DNA contains a quarter of a cow genome. I mean, come on. What is a snake 1/4 cow? Look, here's one of my favorites. The California purple sea urchin. I've been harping about this for years. The California purple sea urchin's genome was sequenced years ago, and they discovered that the California purple sea urchin's genome shares about almost 30-something% of the genes found in a human genome. Now, I don't know if you know what a sea urchin is, but you can hold them in the palm of your hand. They're spiny-looking round things, and they're about the size of a golf ball, not including the spikes on them. Is that thing 28 to 30% anatomically like a human being? No. So, what what do we get from this idea of genetic similarity? A California purple sea urchin is roughly 27 to 8% genetically similar to a human being, but they are woefully different anatomically in their structural design. They are absolutely nothing like a human being and share no similarities except they have a mouth and an anus. That's it. So how much genetic similarity do you need? If we look at 90 something percent genetic similarity, is that evidence that we're anatomically the same? It's not. So,
Well, it sounds like they're cherry picking the data is what they're doing.
it really is. And what they're basing this on is the similarity in protein codes. Now, here's the problem with that. Similarity in protein codes means nothing. Similarity is not good enough. If a protein varies by one amino acid or more, it is not the same protein. It may be in the same class of proteins, like a proteins that are capable of breaking down, let's say, potassium or niacin or riboflavin or any other thing that might be labeled in the same class, organized, right? But the difference is, the problem is this. A difference in proteins of even one or more amino acids in the chain produces a different protein. It's not the same. It may be classified by scientists because of its function, what it's intended to do in a specific class. That's fine. But is the protein the same? No, it's not. 80% of the proteins in chimpanzees and humans are different by at least one amino acid. Now, evolutionists would say, oh, big deal, one amino acid. But wait, when it comes to a protein, they are so incredibly specific that one amino acid difference makes a world of difference when it comes to a protein. A world of difference. The folding of the three-dimensional structure of that molecule is different into a three-dimensional. The product, the end product, is physically a different shape because of a single amino acid between a human and a chimpanzee. Now, if 80% of the proteins in humans and chimps are different, we would expect that if humans and chimpanzees were 90 something genetically similar to each other, that we would find that 80% of the proteins would be the same, not different. See, that's the opposite of what we would expect if evolution were true.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So, and then of course, protein evolution is impossible. That's a whole nother disproof of evolution theory there. We could go into that. But protein evolution just can't happen. They're specific. They're so incredibly specific, in fact, that messing with a protein by changing a single amino acid by mutation results in a protein which either is completely dysfunctional and will be chewed up by the machinery of the cell and its amino acids reused to make a new one, or it's of diminished capacity and that results in a disease.
So what you're saying is even a small change in one amino acid is detrimental to that protein and ultimately the organism.
The tiniest change, one amino acid, makes a difference. Yes, it will.
And how do they attempt to get past that, Neff? If you don't mind me asking, well, what's the rescue device to that? I mean, it's inexplainable within an evolutionary worldview.
Well, there is no rescue mechanism. The method of dealing with it is to simply say, from my experience when dealing with evolutionists in debate, is to simply deny that the difference caused by mutation is as destructive as it is.
Oh, okay.
You don't have to take my word for that. You can look up biophysicist Hubert Yockey on YouTube and find a talk by him where he states to an audience, in fact, now he's putting his credentials online, he'll state that if an amino acid change of a single amino acid change takes place to a protein code, in other words, the machinery of the cell reads a protein, information in the cell, and it's producing an RNA. That's a copy Because you have to understand, you and I have to understand, there are people listening to us that haven't a clue what we're talking about, right? And some of what we're saying is going over their heads. Others, they're informed. But let me put it like this. The DNA molecule codes for a protein. A protein is a molecule that that makes that is a molecular machine component, or a machine by itself in the cell. And there are machines that attach to the DNA, and they run down the DNA molecule, and they copy the little bits of data there, and they spit out a copy of it like a ticker tape. Okay, that's called an RNA. That's then sent through a series of machinery that produces a protein. Okay, the protein is a molecule that squeezes down, folds upon itself, and becomes like a collection of Lego bricks. It has a three-dimensional structural shape, right? Exactly what Lego bricks are in that conglomerate of Lego bricks determines exactly the shape of that collection of Lego bricks. If you change a single amino acid in a protein code, you change the structure of the protein molecule. Now, when you do that, the function is diminished or gone completely. One of the two. Usually, the larger the protein is, the more likely it is to be diminished rather than completely gone. Small proteins suffer most dramatically from a change of a single amino acid, right? But it's detrimental. Even if it happens to large proteins, a single amino acid substitution in a protein code caused by mutation results in a protein which has diminished functionality. That can result in something like somebody having hypoglycemia, where their body is not capable of processing sugar properly. And they run, their blood sugar runs low because the molecules that do this process are inefficient. That's a detriment. That's not a good thing. I'm hypoglycemic. Hypoglycemia is not a good thing. You don't want to be hypoglycemic. I promise you. So
Okay, so what they do is they downplay the evidence, just like with anything. Just like, for example, with genetic entropy, they won't admit that these near neutral mutations are as deleterious as we're saying they are, even though all serious population geneticists agree that man is presently degenerating and these near neutral mutations are accumulating in the genome. So they downplay that, just like they downplay the fact that a single mutation in an amino acid is detrimental to the protein and to the organism. They downplay. That's all they can do.
they have to, because the evolutionists are determined not to give up the ghost on any of their claims,
Yeah,
because they know that if they give up one, it's going to cause the whole house of cards to fall.
It's a ripple effect, because we see,
right.
as we said in the first hour, there's no observable mechanism that adds new novel information. We're degrading, we're degenerating. This information can't arise naturalistically. Obviously, evolution is chemically bound. I mean, nothing can solve that problem. These proteins can't come about. The evolution of proteins is impossible. Phylogenetic systematics is based on a false assumption that universal common ancestry is true, and obviously we went through all the inconsistencies there. Even human to chimpanzee genetic identity, which they said was 98 to 99% similar. Now we actually see that actual genetic identity is only about 88% similar. But to put that into perspective for the audience, that's 400 million DNA differences that exist between the two species. So that suddenly doesn't seem too consistent with evolutionary theory as well, right?
Exactly. I mean, well, nothing is consistent with science when it comes to
No.
evolution. Nothing. So here again, we see this idea that mutations can build proteins or build incrementally structural designs in an organism. If they can't do anything but degrade a protein's function, how in the world are they supposed to create the stinger in a scorpion's tail or the eyeball in a human being when they can't even make a protein that's functional? I mean, come on.
They can't make a protein that's functional. They can't provide us with that, information adding mechanism. All the examples that they provide, whether it's sickle cell anemia, nylon digestion, it's all degraded examples. Everything we know about genetics now is actually on the side and evidence for creation. Even if we get a little bit, deep here and technical and kind of go into some of what they think is their best evidence on a genetic level. Even their famous human chromosome 2 that they say is arose from a fusion of two ape-like chromosomes. Now we know that this apparent fusion site, quote unquote, is actually a functional DNA element in a human gene. So all their evidence is collapsing, even their so-called best evidence, like human chromosome 2.
And that's the thing. It's the evolutionism requires, it's actually based, it's not on science. It's based on assumptions. Every claim of evolution, if you whittle it down and look at it carefully, you'll find that it's not based on empirical science. It's based on an assumption. And you'll find, if you dig into it, that it actually contradicts real science. So just as you pointed out about chromosome 2, there are genes that are critically important to the organism that span across what is called a fusion site. How could the merger of two chromosomes create a functional gene that's critical to an organism? It makes no sense.
Impossible.
That's nonsense. So the idea was an assumption that was disproved by actual more recent scientific discovery. Yep.
It's all concoctions based on that junk DNA paradigm. But now that we see all these, like even RNA, for example, decades ago it was considered the underappreciated, RNA molecule. Now we know it's doing so many unexpected functions. Chromosome 2 was developed and derived based on that junk DNA paradigm. But now we know, just like you said, it's within a functional gene, right? Is that the DDX?
DDX2?
11L2?
Yeah, 1102. Yeah, I occasionally still come across, and it's pretty rare, but I guess once a year or something, I come across a video where some atheist has uploaded this snippet of Brown University biologist Kenneth Miller talking about, and see, look, there it is. Therefore, the creation is wrong. And I just look at that, and I just almost with embarrassment put my hand over my face, and it's like a face palm. Oh, great Scots, again. This guy, are you serious? Why isn't Kenneth Miller absolutely embarrassed over his claim that chromosome 2 is some kind of irrefutable proof that humans are related to apes?
Exactly.
He should be, and I hope that he is. I truly hope he is. And one of the things that I find most disparaging about it is that he's a Christian.
Yeah, well,
so he says,
just like Francis Collins, right? They're Christian, but at the end of the day, they should be embarrassed by still trying to use the same evidence that these atheistic evolutionists are using, like chromosome 2, for example.
Yeah, and that's why that's one of the reasons why I think understanding that creation is true, which is espoused most clearly by the scriptures, is something that a creationist needs to hold to regardless of any other belief, because going against God's word has proven to scientifically lead to failure. You're going to fail if you come against the scriptures with science, what you call science. It's pseudoscience. You're going to fail because science evermore seems to completely vindicate the scriptures. And that's the amazing thing to me. And so why these Christians, they'll say, well, it's allegorical when it says God created 6 days and 6,000 years ago. That's allegory. It doesn't really mean that. It means something else. No, it doesn't. What God's word says, you're not accepting God's word. And then science verifies what the scriptures say. And what these people do, they keep on espousing, just as Kenneth Miller will do, because he's entrenched now. He can't give up the ghost. That would mean academic embarrassment beyond belief. Right?
Academic suicide.
Right. He's not going to go there. He's not going to admit, oh, well, I'm wrong and the creationists are right. Even if he discovers it, he probably would not, because then he would lose his $125,000 a year job, be gone. Right. He's not going to do that.
Well, these Christians they're putting their faith in man instead of, in the wisdom of man instead of the power of God. And I seen a little snippet of you talking to Inspiring Philosophy, who was trying to say that when Jesus, said at the beginning of creation, he made them male and female. And I'm sure you remember this discussion that you're having with him. And just to see the disparity and the compromise in his answer for how that wasn't really the beginning of the creation, even though that's clearly what Jesus was saying, is really just calling Jesus a liar. I mean, do you remember that conversation I'm referring to?
No, I don't. But in a way, it is. You're calling God's word a lie. You're saying God's word isn't true, and that's just not appropriate for a Christian, and it's not intellectually honest either. To be
No,
honest.
it's not, because it's totally contradictory to empirical science and to obviously the scriptures, which is our final authority at the end of the day. And as we're demonstrating here, all science points to a young earth creation model. And what's amazing is the fact that now we actually have the testable falsifiable prediction. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's work on, the pre-existing heterozygosity model, but what he's saying is that if these ancestors, say to modern species, possessed millions of heterozygous nuclear DNA sites, new species can arise naturally, right? Through the processes of, say, recombination and gene conversion.
Oh yeah. You're talking about what they call the third way. Now, I think evolutionists have discovered they have to have another way because Darwinian evolution failed. Evolutionists, scientists today universally agree Darwin was wrong. Believe that or not. You tell an atheist that and they'll say, no, that's not true. No, it's true. Listen, evolutionists, university professors today in biology, genetics, phylogeny, etc., they all agree Darwin was wrong. Organisms don't naturally change in their structural design because of environmental pressures. There has to be a biological mechanism for it. That's called neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism is the merger of the discovery of DNA with evolution theory, and so the belief that random genetic mutation creates the genetic information that causes the structural design change to the organism. That's neo-Darwinism. Now, what they've found is neo-Darwinism itself has failed. And evolutionist scientists themselves, some of the more prominent ones, are acknowledging we must find a third way. So they're discovering and researching something they call, and you can look this up and find it for yourself. Look up in your favorite browser, quote unquote, the third way, space evolution. And what you'll find is the evolutionist professors, prominent ones, are now espousing that there must be a third way. There is a third way. And it's what you just spoke about, brother, which is this idea that genetic variation, natural variation, which is really nothing more than a product of breeding, of reproduction, is by itself the real mechanism for evolution. So really what we're finding is evolution has been dumbed down. It's been smacked around by real science so bad the evolutionists are now claiming that simple reproduction, just having babies, itself is the mechanism for evolution. It's not so much based on genetic mutation as natural variation that's caused by the machinery of the cell. It's internal. See, that's the quote, third way, end quote. And we know that's not true too.
Yeah, no, I mean it's quite amazing at how consistent it really is within a biblical worldview versus how contradictory it is within an evolutionary worldview. I think we've touched on quite a bit of good things, quite a bit of evidence against evolution and obviously for creation. One last thing I'd like to ask you about before we end it here. Their claim that, say, ERVs, endogenous retroviruses, as evidence, for their phylogenetic trees, universal common ancestry. But now we know these ERVs are obviously part of that junk DNA paradigm. They're showing, functional roles, say in the placenta, the embryo, immune, I think, type functions. How do you feel about that? And how do you feel like, or how would you say that that's not evidence for universal common ancestry?
Yeah, what is called an endogenous retrovirus is not actually viral at all. It's not. This is a myth. It's not the information of a genome. What the evolutionists claim is that uh, in the distant past, in fact, throughout the history of evolution, organisms became infected with viruses, and the viruses added their information to the genome of the organism, and that can happen. That's a real mechanism. It can happen. It happens in your genome. This is part of your immune system. In fact, that's an intelligent design process that refutes evolution by itself. Another one. So, but nonetheless, they say that the virus infected an organism, and then the viral information, because we can find a string of DNA nucleotides, ACGT, in a certain pattern, like AACGGTT, whatever, however long it might be in a human being, and we can find that exact same pattern, 15 or 50 nucleotides, base pairs long, rather, in the genome of a human being, as well as in a chimpanzee. This is evidence that that's information, that's the genome, a snippet of information in the genome of a virus that is present in a human and present in a chimpanzee, and that links us hereditarily. The reason we both have it is because we came from a common ancestor that got infected with a virus long in the great distant past. And now we split off from our common ancestor and both carry the viral information from a virus in our genome. Okay, that's the claim. So let's look at that for a second. Let's imagine that 4.5 million years ago, chimps and human beings diverged. Okay, and they both carried off the genome, the information. Firstly, genetic similarity by itself is not evidence of evolution. It's been discovered that you can find a pattern of DNA sequence of base pairs in the genome of one creature and in another, and they code for different functions in that organism. So it's possible that the information in the genome of a chimpanzee and a human, even though they constitute the same base pairs in a row, actually could code for different information that does different function in the chimpanzee or the human. Okay, that's problem number one. Number two is that if a virus was to infect the genome of a common ancestor and become fused into it, then what happened to this evolutionist idea that mutations subsequently change the DNA so much that they rewrite the genome all the time? Why didn't it rewrite that so that we find the similarity? See, problem number two. Okay, number three is we've discovered that this information that are sequences in a chimpanzee or in a human being that say the same exact base pairs in a row for a certain string, as I said, code for different information, but often it's discovered that many of these now code for critically important information. For example, microbiologist Richard Sternberg has explained. I'll give you, use him as an example, that what is considered to be a specific retrovirus in the human genome is so critical to the development of human beings that when when a human being develops, first you get a fertilized cell, and then it splits into two. The two split into four, the four split into eight, then 8 and 16, 16 to 32, 32 to 64, 128. It goes on like that. That's how an organism develops, by cell splitting, right? At the stage where the human genome is 4 cells, just 4, If this retrovirus is not present, no more cell splitting will take place. And also, um, it's been discovered that these sequences of information, which are considered to be retroviruses, are critical to the formation of the human liver, the human heart, the human pancreas, the human kidneys. Now, here's the problem. If they are so critical information that they develop features which are of astonishing complexity, I mean, the the complexity of a human organ like a kidney or the pancreas or something is so incredible. It is mind-bendingly complex. It is, I'm telling you, it is astonishingly complex, right? This information is like an instruction manual for how to regulate other genes to make a kidney or a protein or I mean a pancreas, right? Now, why is it logical to believe that the information in the genome of a virus has the critical information necessary to regulate the genes that are specific to the anatomy of a human being so as to produce a feature that is woefully, worlds, orders of magnitude more complex than a virus itself? It makes no sense at all. It's like saying, I believe that a pamphlet for how to assemble a bicycle could have the critical information on how to regulate the workers in a factory to assemble a Ford SUV. That's nonsense. Why would we believe such a thing? So this is outrageously powerful evidence that what's called a retrovirus is never been a virus. It was never a virus at all. It's a common element of design found in various creatures. It's simply the same pattern of DNA found in a string, but it regulates for important functions, critical functions, in developing the features of different organisms, which are remarkably different and outrageously, orders of magnitude, more complex than a virus. So it makes no sense whatsoever to believe that the instructions in the genome of a tiny little virus, which may be up to maybe 3,000 base pairs long, could possibly have the information necessary to regulate the expression of numerous genes, hundreds, if not thousands of genes in the human genome to produce something as outrageously complex as a pancreas or a kidney or a liver or a lung that makes no sense at all. So this tells us that there is scientifically it's implausible to believe that these supposed retroviral DNAs found in humans or chimpanzees are actually the information from a virus. It never was. It was critical information put into the genome of by the designer that regulates information to produce features that are completely outrageously more complex than information in the virus. Again, I'll come back to why should we believe that a simple pamphlet of 10 pages of information in the that tell you how to assemble the parts of a bicycle could possibly relate to if you found those same words, for example, in a pattern in the instruction manual somewhere for the production of a Ford car, but in the Ford car they don't describe how to assemble a bicycle. They describe how to assemble an engine, a 4.8 liter twin cam V8 engine, right? Why would you believe that that's instruction manual for a bicycle actually is related to the instructions for the Ford automobile on how to assemble something of vastly more complexity, such as the 4.8 liter twin cam V8 engine? It makes no sense to believe that. So the evidence is that these are not actually viral information. They're simply common design elements that relate to outrageously different complex features in different creatures. And it's not plausible that they were ever the information of a virus that got infected in a common ancestor. I hope I explained that in a way that people could understand.
Oh, you know what? I lost count about how many good points you brought up. I mean, that certainly dismantles, these endogenous retroviruses as any type of evidence for universal common ancestry. It kind of reminds me of, I mean, that's proof that obviously evolution is non-science and nonsensical. And it kind of reminds me of some of these pseudo genes as well. Like the evolutionists will say that, humans, just for one example that has been debunked and addressed, they'll say that, and you're probably familiar with this, that humans have the remain of a gene devoted to egg yolk production in our DNA in exactly the same place that evolution would predict. But we know based on the recent research, Neff, that it's been exposed as nearly impossible to reconcile with the actual facts, because this supposed evidence for this, say, egg yolk pseudogene is actually it's pathetic. It's hard to
Right.
imagine, just like these ERVs, it's hard to imagine how anyone could have seriously entertained this hypothesis. So it kind of reminds me of the ERVs, because it's like identifying, say, the letter E in the Bible and then finding the same exact letter in Darwin's On the Origin of Species, and then claiming that the books were modified from a common ancestor. I mean, it really is a
Right.
stretch of the imagination,
It
right?
is. In fact, the egg layer thing is ridiculous because a different layer, a germ layer in the cell of one creature produces the egg in one creature, but it produces something completely different in another. And so that's the same problem we have with worms and other creatures. It doesn't make sense. In the worm, it produces certain features, I forgot what, but in the human being, that germ layer produces the human heart. What what similarity is there? you know, there's no similarity. The assumptions of evolutionists go into la la land. They truly do.
Yeah. It's exactly why my icon is SpongeBob, just imagine, because most of this requires a lot of imagination. And that's exactly why I say they have a science fiction based religion. I like the fact that we covered, phylogenetic systematics, chromosome 2, ERVs. We covered and touched a little bit on, new information. But everything is obviously consistent with a biblical model, Neff. We see degradation, genome-wide degradation. All they have is rescue devices. All they have is straw man arguments against us. At the end of the day, I want to thank you for coming on. Hopefully we can do it again soon. I know we have a
Yeah.
discussion against some atheists on Saturday. If you want to give some final words, some conclusions here. But yep, most importantly, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I know you're a busy guy. You got a popular channel. I want to tell everybody to obviously subscribe to you. You're very technical, very knowledgeable. And I, for one, certainly learned a few things here and had a lot of fun dismantling evolution. Go ahead, Neff.
Well, I appreciate you having me, and I enjoyed it. You're knowledgeable yourself, and I really enjoyed talking to you. I'd love to do it again, and I just would leave these things with you. Uh, the truth is what it is. It's not what we want to believe. It's what it is. And the truth is this, that atheism and evolutionism are not only implausible, but scientifically and philosophically incorrect. They cannot be true. Everything about philosophy and science discredit atheism. Um, People who are atheists are people who are dedicated to an idea that they don't have a holy God to be accountable to. That's why they become an atheist. Charles Darwin um, did never espouse anything about evolution theory until after his favorite daughter suffered for a year with stomach cancer, probably cancer. We don't know for sure, but she suffered for a year with a stomach ailment that caused her terrible pain and suffering and then died. This angered Charles Darwin terribly, and he got mad at God. It was only because he was angry at God that he was willing to put forth his godless theory of evolution. Had that not happened, he would not have. So, uh, atheists are people who dis, they disavow the moral authority of God because their human pride causes them to reject God's authority and they refuse to humble themselves to God and ask to be forgiven for wrongdoing. They declare themselves innocent, but it won't wash with God. God is holy and he will judge us all. He's willing to give you eternal life in paradise if you're willing to get on your knees and say, Lord, I'm a sinner, forgive me. If you don't, you lose everything. Don't be a loser. Find Christ. He's the truth, and He's the creator, and He designed everything, and He made it so astonishing that my friend and I are having conversations about it. If it weren't so, we wouldn't even be here. Thanks for having me, brother.
Not a problem, brother. You know what? I think I thank you for that last little plea to sinners to find Christ. He's made it easy. Romans 4:5 tells us, to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness. Salvation's easy.
It's
He
right.
died for us. He did
Salvation
all
is
the work.
easy. That's right. It's
It's
easy to
and
become
and people
saved.
make it so difficult. He's given us this beautiful creation to know he exists. Why fight it? Why fight the evidence? I couldn't have said it better myself, brother Neff. And all we can do is pray for, a lot of these atheists and evolutionists. He's made it easy. He's done
That's
all the
right.
work. We just got to put our faith on him.
That's exactly right. Let me just say this one more thing. It's, as you said, it's easy to become saved. It's easy to become saved. The problem is that atheists don't want to live through what it means to be saved. Living through one's salvation can be, for some people, more troublesome than others. It depends on what baggage you bring with you from your sinful life to Christ when you come. But it's easy to become saved. It can be tricky or tough or emotional, they're troublesome to live through it, because
Yeah.
you'll find that you're struggling against the sins of your own flesh for the rest of your life. But the process of becoming saved is easy. As you said, Christ is full of grace, full of it, and He will grant you that for your faith. The rest, you're going to find trouble. There's going to be hardship along the line. You're going to find, how do I not give this up, Lord? Why didn't I give it up before then? How do I overcome this? You're going to find those struggles. It's in life. That's what we go through as Christians. But the end result is so worth it, to have eternal life with a loving God who considers you his child is amazing. Amazing. Jesus Christ set a child on his lap and said, woe unto him who would offend one of these little ones who believe in me. Better that a millstone be put on his neck and be cast into the depths of the sea. And Jesus said in the Revelation, when he spoke to John, he said, there'll be no more tears. He said he will wipe away their tears. Now, when he said that, that's an image, a literary device. God is saying to John, in that passage, it's an image. We read books, we read novels, and skilled authors create images in our minds that we can see from the words they use. The more skilled the author, the more profound the image we get in their mind. And in the book of Revelation, it says that God will wipe away our tears, and there'll be no more suffering, no more sorrow, right? This is an image of a father taking a child, setting it on his leg, and taking the back of his finger and wiping a tear physically from their eye and saying, now, my sweet child, no more crying. There's no need. That is a miraculous, a beautiful, astonishingly beautiful thing found in the scripture. God is literally telling us that he loves us so dearly that he is willing to put his back of his finger on our eye and drag it across to take our tear away and say, I love you, child. No more tears. That's the love of God found in Jesus Christ. And atheists need to understand the Bible is not a book about hatred, and God is not a monster sitting in a throne with his fist balled up saying, oh, I hate those little filthy human beings, I can't wait to smash them. That's not God. That's not God. God is the one he describes in Revelation, willing to wipe our tears away and say, I love you, child. No more tears. Anyway, thank you, brother, for having me. I appreciate it.
Amen, brother. Anytime. Thanks for the amazing, loving words there, and hopefully we can do it again soon. We'll certainly stay in touch. I hope everybody had fun. But until then, we'll talk to you later. Everybody have a good night. And thanks again, Neff. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you.